Have you ever wondered about the courage it takes to reach for healing when the world has taught you to hide? In the crowded streets of first-century Palestine, there lived a woman whose name we will never know, whose face has been forgotten by history, but whose single moment of desperate faith changed everything. Tonight, as you settle into rest, let us walk gently through her story, through the quiet years of suffering that led to one brief, transformative touch. Stay with me as we discover what drove her to risk everything for a chance at wholeness, and how sometimes the most powerful acts of faith happen in the space between hope and desperation, witnessed only by the one who sees all hidden things. Picture, if you will, the narrow streets of Capernaum on a day when word had spread that the teacher had returned from across the lake. The morning sun cast long shadows between the whitewashed houses, and already the crowds were gathering, drawn by stories of healing that seemed too wonderful to believe. Fishermen abandoned their nets, merchants closed their stalls, mothers carried sick children in their arms, all moving toward the shoreline where a boat was said to be landing. Among them moved a woman, her face hidden beneath a dark veil, her steps careful and deliberate. For 12 years, she had lived in the shadows of this very town, watching life unfold from a distance, knowing the weight of ceremonial law that made her presence a source of defilement to others. 12 years of bleeding that would not stop. 12 years of physicians who promised much and delivered little. 12 years of watching her savings disappear and her hope diminish with each passing season. The law of Moses was clear about her condition. She was unclean, untouchable, separated from the community of faith by circumstances beyond her control. She could not enter the synagogue, could not participate in festivals, could not embrace her family or friends without making them unclean as well. She had become a living ghost, present but not acknowledged, seen but not welcomed, surviving on the margins of a society that had no place for her suffering. But on this morning, something was different. Word had reached even the hidden corners where the forgotten lived. Word about a teacher who welcomed tax collectors and sinners, who touched lepers and made them clean, who seemed to operate by a different set of rules than those that governed ordinary religious life. She had heard the stories whispered in the marketplace, tales of a paralyzed man who walked, of a centurion's servant healed from a distance, of demons cast out and sight restored to the blind. For months, she had wrestled with the possibility, turning it over in her mind like a stone examined from every angle. Could it be true? Could this teacher really have power over the very forces that had held her captive for so long? And if he did, would he use that power for someone like her? Someone whose very presence violated the purity codes that seemed so important to everyone else? The decision had not come easily. She had spent sleepless nights weighing the risks, understanding that even approaching him in a crowd would be an act of rebellion against everything she had been taught about her place in the world. To touch him would be to make him unclean, to potentially ruin his reputation among the very people he was trying to reach. Yet the alternative was to continue living as she had been living, growing weaker with each passing day, watching her life slowly ebb away like water poured out on dry ground. So she had made her plan, simple and desperate in equal measure. She would not burden him with her story, would not force him to make a choice about her worthiness for healing. She would simply touch the edge of his garment as he passed by, believing somehow that even this small contact might be enough. If the power was real, if he truly carried the healing presence of God, then perhaps just this brief touch would be sufficient to break the bonds that had held her for so long. The crowd was thick that morning, pressing close around the teacher as he made his way through the streets. She could hear his voice occasionally, warm and strong, speaking words of comfort to those who called out to him. She caught glimpses of his face, younger than she had expected, marked by a compassion that seemed to encompass everyone within his sight. This was no distant religious figure, no untouchable holy man. This was someone who seemed genuinely present to the pain and hope of ordinary people. Working her way through the crowd required all her remaining strength. People pressed against her without knowing who she was, their casual contact a reminder of the isolation that had defined her existence for so long. Children ran between the legs of adults, laughing and calling to one another. Women chattered about their daily concerns, their voices full of life and normalcy that seemed to belong to another world entirely. As she drew closer, her heart began to race with a mixture of fear and anticipation. What if nothing happened? What if the stories were exaggerated, the healings explained by natural causes she did not understand? What if her faith was not strong enough, her need not great enough to warrant divine intervention? The questions multiplied with each step, but something deeper than doubt kept her moving forward, some wordless conviction that this was her moment, her chance to step from shadow into light. When the opportunity came, it happened faster than she had imagined. The teacher paused to speak with someone in the crowd, and the press of people brought her within arm's reach of where he stood. She could see the blue fringe of his prayer shawl, the carefully woven tassels that marked him as a faithful son of Israel. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she reached out her hand, her fingers trembling with 12 years of desperate hope. The touch was so brief that no one else could have noticed it, just the lightest contact between her fingertip and the edge of his garment. But in that instant, everything changed. She felt it immediately, a warmth that began where her finger had made contact and spread through her body like light flowing through clear water. The weakness that had plagued her for years was simply gone, replaced by a vitality she had almost forgotten was possible. The constant pain that had been her unwelcome companion vanished as completely as if it had never existed. For a moment, she could hardly believe what had happened. She stood frozen in the crowd, her hand still extended, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what she had experienced. She was whole, she was clean, she was free. The bleeding that had defined her existence for 12 years had simply stopped, and she knew with absolute certainty that it would not return. But then the teacher stopped walking. She watched in growing alarm as he turned toward the crowd, his eyes searching the faces around him with an intensity that made her heart sink. She heard him ask the question she had dreaded, "Who touched me?" His disciples seemed confused, pointing out the obvious fact that many people were touching him in the press of the crowd. But his gaze continued to move across the faces nearby, and she realized with growing panic that he knew exactly what had happened. The moment of decision had arrived again, but this time the choice was not about whether to reach for healing. This time she had to decide whether to claim what had already been given, whether to step out of the shadows and acknowledge publicly what had taken place between them. Every instinct told her to slip away, to disappear back into the crowd and treasure her healing in secret. But something in his eyes, some quality of compassion that transcended her fear, drew her forward instead. She fell at his feet, her entire body trembling as the words tumbled out of her. 12 years of silence broke open as she told him everything, the long years of suffering, the failed treatments, the isolation, the desperate hope that had brought her to this moment. She confessed her act of touching him, knowing that by the letter of the law, she had made him unclean. She waited for rebuke, for the condemnation that religious leaders had always pronounced upon people like her. Instead, she heard words that would echo in her heart for the rest of her days. "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Not anger, but affirmation. Not condemnation, but blessing. Not judgment, but a declaration of relationship that restored her not just to health, but to community, not just to physical wholeness, but to spiritual daughterhood. The crowd around them had grown silent, sensing that they were witnessing something profound. Some had heard her story whispered in corners, had known about the woman who lived on the margins. Now they saw her transformed, not just healed, but affirmed, not just made whole, but welcomed into the circle of those whom God called daughter and son. But the story does not end with her healing. Remarkable as that was, it continues in the mystery of what happened next, in the way she seems to disappear from the narrative as suddenly as she had appeared. The Gospels give us no record of her name, no account of her later life, no details about how she used her newfound freedom. She touches history with her act of faith and then vanishes back into the ordinary world, carrying her healing like a secret gift. Perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps her anonymity is part of the gift, a reminder that the most important transformations often happen quietly, witnessed only by the one who sees all hidden things. Perhaps her story speaks most powerfully, not because we know what happened to her afterward, but because we can imagine ourselves in her place, reaching out in desperate hope for a touch that might change everything. Think about the courage it must have taken for her to step out of 12 years of enforced isolation and reach for something she was not sure she deserved. Consider the faith required to believe that a brief touch might accomplish what years of conventional treatment had failed to achieve. Reflect on the vulnerability of falling at his feet and telling the truth about her condition to a crowd that included people who had shunned her for years. In her story, we see reflected our own deepest longings for healing, for acceptance, for the restoration of things that have been broken too long. We recognize our own fear of being rejected, our own hesitation to ask for what we most need, our own tendency to hide in the shadows rather than step into the light where both healing and judgment seem equally possible. Yet her example calls us forward, reminding us that sometimes the very thing we think disqualifies us from receiving grace is precisely what prepares us to recognize it when it comes. Her years of suffering had taught her the value of wholeness in a way that someone who had never been broken could not understand. Her experience of exclusion had made her hungry for acceptance in a way that those who had never been rejected might take for granted. Tonight, as you rest, let your mind linger with this unnamed woman, this daughter of faith, whose courage to reach out in hope changed not just her own life, but the understanding of everyone who witnessed what happened. Feel the weight of her 12 years of waiting, but feel also the lightness of her healing, the joy of her restoration, the peace of her acceptance. In a world that often seems to value only the strong, the successful, the socially acceptable, her story reminds us that God's healing touch is available to all who reach for it in faith, regardless of their past, regardless of their condition, regardless of what others might think about their worthiness to receive grace. Picture her one more time, no longer hiding behind a veil, no longer afraid of ceremonial contamination, no longer living on the margins of community life. See her walking freely through the streets of Capernaum, her step light, her heart full, her future open before her like a door that has finally been unlocked. She carries within her the memory of that transformative touch, the echo of those healing words, the knowledge that she is beloved daughter of the Most High God. Let her courage inspire your own reaching, her faith strengthen your own believing, her healing kindle hope for your own restoration. In the mystery of her disappearance from the narrative, find the assurance that some of life's most important moments happen not in the spotlight of public attention, but in the sacred space between need and grace, between question and answer, between reaching out and being embraced. Rest now in the peace that comes from knowing that no condition is too chronic, no isolation too complete, no need too great for the healing touch of divine love. Like this unnamed woman, you too are seen, you too are known, you too are called daughter or son by the one who has power to heal what has been broken and restore what has been lost. Sleep comes gently, carrying with it the assurance that morning will bring new opportunities to reach out in faith, new chances to experience the transforming power of grace. New moments when the touch of the divine might break through the ordinary circumstances of life and make all things new. In the silence of the night, let her story settle into your heart like a blessing, a reminder that you are never too lost to be found, never too broken to be healed, never too forgotten to be remembered by the one whose love reaches out to touch the untouchable and make them whole. But let us linger a moment longer with her story, for there is more to discover in the quiet spaces between the words recorded by the gospel writers. Think about those 12 years that preceded her healing, the countless ordinary days when she woke to the same reality of isolation and pain, when hope seemed as distant as the stars above Galilee. Imagine her in the early years of her condition, when she still believed that the next physician might hold the answer. The next treatment might bring relief. Picture her counting out her coins to pay for remedies that promised much and delivered little, watching her resources dwindle as her condition remained unchanged. Feel the weight of each failed attempt, each raised hope that was dashed against the reality of her persistent suffering. Consider the social dimensions of her isolation, how friends gradually stopped visiting, how family members grew uncomfortable with the restrictions her condition placed on their religious observance. She would have learned to recognize the subtle signs of discomfort in others' faces, the way conversations faltered when she approached, the careful distance people maintained even when they meant to be kind. Yet through it all, some spark of faith must have remained alive within her, some wordless trust that her story was not finished, that the God of her fathers had not forgotten her completely. Perhaps she found comfort in the ancient stories of Hannah, who waited so long for the child she desired, or of Job, who suffered inexplicably but held fast to his faith in divine goodness. The morning of her healing must have begun like so many others, with the familiar weight of limitation, the careful navigation of a world that was not designed for people in her condition. But somewhere in the depth of her being, hope was stirring, awakened perhaps by the growing rumors about this teacher who seemed to see people differently than others did. Watch her as she makes her preparations for what she knows will be either her greatest triumph or her most devastating disappointment. See her hands as they arrange her veil, ensuring that her identity will remain hidden in the crowd. Feel the trembling in her legs as she steps out of her dwelling place, knowing that what she is about to attempt could bring her either healing or humiliation. The journey through the streets toward where the teacher was said to be must have felt like a pilgrimage through her own past, each corner revealing memories of exclusion, each familiar face a reminder of relationship interrupted by circumstance beyond her control. Yet she continued walking, driven by something stronger than fear, pulled forward by a hope that had survived 12 years of disappointment. As the crowd around the teacher came into view, she would have felt the old familiar anxiety about being discovered, about contaminating others by her presence. But mingled with that fear was something new, a growing conviction that this teacher might be different, that his understanding of purity and defilement might transcend the categories that had governed her existence for so long. The touch itself, when it finally came, lasted only a moment, but in that brief contact, 12 years of suffering were transformed into testimony. The healing was immediate and complete, not partial or gradual as she might have hoped, but total and undeniable. Her body, which had been a source of limitation and shame, became suddenly a vessel of wholeness and strength. But perhaps the deeper healing came not in the physical transformation, powerful as that was, but in the public affirmation that followed. When the teacher called her daughter, he was not simply acknowledging what had happened to her body. He was restoring her to the community of faith, declaring her worthy of the tender relationship that exists between a loving father and a beloved child. In that moment, she was no longer the unclean woman who had touched him illicitly. She was daughter, recognized and claimed, not despite her condition, but through her faith, not in spite of her desperate act, but because of the courage it represented. The same faith that had driven her to risk everything for healing was now publicly honored as the means by which grace had flowed into her life. The crowd that day witnessed more than a healing. They saw a demonstration of how God's kingdom operates according to principles that transcend human categories of worthy and unworthy, clean and unclean, acceptable and unacceptable. They learned that faith, not status, is the currency of grace, that reaching out in hope, not moral perfection, opens the door to divine intervention. And then she disappears from our view, this woman whose faith changed everything. We are left to wonder about her journey home that evening, about the way she told her story to those who had known her suffering, about how she spent the first night in 12 years when she went to sleep in a body that was completely whole. Did she return to the synagogue the next Sabbath, taking her place among the women who had prayed beside her before her condition separated her from community worship? Did she find courage to embrace family members from whom she had been isolated for so long? Did she discover that physical healing brought its own challenges as she learned to navigate relationships that had been redefined by years of enforced distance? These questions remain unanswered, wrapped in the mystery of her anonymity. But perhaps that very mystery is part of the gift her story offers. In not knowing what happened to her afterward, we are free to see her healing as representative rather than exceptional, as a sign of what is possible for all who reach out in faith, rather than a unique experience granted to only one special person. Her story becomes our story, her courage inspires our own reaching, her healing kindles hope for our own restoration. In the darkness of our own struggles, whatever form they may take, we can remember that somewhere in the crowd around Jesus, there is always room for one more desperate touch, one more act of faith, one more transformation that turns suffering into testimony. Tonight, as sleep draws near, let the image of her healed presence bring peace to your own places of brokenness. Feel the warmth of that healing touch spreading through whatever areas of your life need restoration. Hear the echo of those affirming words, "Daughter, son, your faith has made you well," spoken over your own journey toward wholeness. In a world that often seems to value only strength, her weakness became the pathway to power. In a society that prized purity, her contamination became the context for cleansing. In a system that enforced exclusion, her desperate inclusion became the door to restoration, not just for herself, but for all who would follow her example of courageous faith. Rest now in the assurance that no night is too dark, no isolation too complete, no condition too chronic for the light of healing grace to penetrate. Like this unnamed woman who touched history with her faith, you too carry within you the capacity to reach out beyond your limitations and touch the hem of infinite possibility.